functional environment, a more functional society. 1980 was no different. And there we were at the school in the midst of the 1980 boycotts and all of the consciousness amongst youth, being told that, hold on, your matric at this school's not convincing enough for us to give you a bursary. You need to go to what was then St. John's in Johannesburg. And those who've been there now, you know, great. I think a lot has changed over time, but you can well imagine what a school like St. John's might have been like back in 1980. And in that context, I couldn't help but turn down that offer. And I then managed to, interestingly, secure employment on the basis of the company offering me an opportunity to study further. And, you know, that was plan B. Now, coming from a background where, yes, a township environment, none of the trappings and none of the niceties that many of our youth enjoy these days, I accepted the offer because it gave me a dual opportunity. It gave me the opportunity to pursue a career in engineering. And the company then also offered me the opportunity to do some courses, some training, and they would pay me a modest salary, a whopping 250 Rand a month. And, you know, with that opportunity, I seized it. My starting point in that company, and today it's known as Arab. It was known back then as Ove Arab and Partners. Its offices were located in Parkwood, in Johannesburg. And I joined them. And my first starting point was being sent on a drafting training course. And that was such an invaluable experience. And, you know, people frown today on starting points being that of an artisan. And we break down the walls of universities and so on. And sometimes there's no space. Sometimes affordability is an issue. And, you know, sometimes we're just not sure quite yet if that's what we want to do. But we may be lucky enough that parents are paying for it, which is quite an expense if you're not quite sure. So off I went, spent 4 months. And by the way, the training center was located in Germiston. And for me, as a young, I guess, young person entering the working environment and the training environment after school, it was a new experience getting onto a metro train from Joburg traveling to Germiston. I can even today still recall the people from a certain Christian belief singing on the trains. I can even sing that for you if you like. But let's not turn this into a Trevor Noah show. But I recall those songs, religious songs that people sang very, very clearly. Having completed the drafting training course, and I must admit, I met some very interesting people. Some were a lot more artistically inclined than what I thought myself to be. But I learned then on how to perceive and represent things from three-dimensional perspective in all of its faces. Drawings these days generally are a representation of that. Whether it's rendered on a computer or it's a 3D virtual image. We didn't have the luxury of technology back then to render images in the 3D. So, you know, anybody who could just sketch something that, you know, helped you, you know, visualize something better, it helped a lot. Of course, I didn't also in my high school do technical drawing. And some of the people on that course had done the technical drawing, so it was sort of a new learning experience. Completed the course, became one of the junior draftspersons at the company, and I think, you know, it was a case of sheer determination to continue realizing your full potential as an ongoing challenge. In fact, I then was fortunate enough, after the first year at the company, managed to get admitted to what was then known as Wits Technikon, so the UJ University of Technology these days. And I did the diploma course. What was great at the time was you did 6 months theory, and because you were automatically tied to a company, after that 6 months, you went in-house into that company and you got the practical exposure to the theory that you'd now covered in the previous period. And it was quite a good learning journey, then morphing almost like, I guess, if you go through all the stages of I hate to think of myself as a butterfly, but certainly that kind of metamorphosis as junior technician, because now I'd learned a little bit more of what goes into the drawing itself, what are the thought processes, and what are the design contexts that you're now starting to provide drawings for that would eventually be used for contractors to price the works and then execute the work. And junior technician, and completed all of those courses. I will be honest, some of them were not as easy as one imagines. I think also I would chalk it down to an absence of reference material. I mean, back then we relied purely on the notes from the lecturer and notes that we made in class. And the reference material in the form of textbooks was virtually non-existent in most cases.
There was no YouTube videos.
And no YouTube, by the way. And you couldn't Google any of the things either. So you really had to navigate your way. And I guess I must say that back then there was a curiosity already, because I did see that some of the students who were doing a bit better actually came from the railways in that same courses I was doing. And they were sponsored by railways. And, you know, you'll understand later why I'm making specific reference to that. Because in the 80s, somebody like myself in engineering, coming from the environment that I did, those were no-go areas. There was just no chance of getting into that environment at the time. I reached the level of a higher diploma in civil engineering, completed that successfully. And then, of course, and maybe, you know, I'd rather not be too honest with you, because I may be advising you inappropriately according to your employer, which is the CESA members. So all I wanted to say is, I had realized that you need to grow. And unfortunately, if you remain with the company with which you started, then somehow you tend to be held in the box. And you don't have the opportunity to grow. And of course, the need to earn more money. By then it was what? 450 Rand a month.
almost.
I was able to contribute to my parents, home. Groceries or whatever else that needed to be paid. I mean, things didn't cost as much as they did today, as they do today. So I guess my contribution did go quite a long way. I also managed to then become self-sustaining, but still lived at home.
I think it's an important point that you're raising because a lot of young engineers are battling, do I remain loyal to my firm and grow within the firm, or do I go out there and look for bigger, better opportunities?
I would certainly say don't be in too much of a hurry. But when the situation starts becoming untenable, and you've had the conversations, because I think any fair and reasonable employer would listen to you. They would look at what your performance has been, and they would then consider whether you merit that additional recognition or not. So it doesn't come automatically, unfortunately, with the studies. So, often there's the expectation, oh, but I've got this now, I've got that now. It's, companies, and much as there are many who would classically still refer to consulting engineering as a practice, and it was deemed to be a practice back then. And there's still some people who have that mindset, and there's nothing wrong with it. It was akin to the legal profession and the way they conducted themselves, the medical profession. But a lot changed over time, and that's why I tend to move away from the notion of a practice and more towards a business, the company. Why do I do that? I think even up to about 1988, 1989, this very organization, South African Association of Consulting Engineers, which is what it was. Consulting Engineers South Africa was, back then, South African Association of Consulting Engineers, and there were certain no-nos at the time, which was certainly in line with the practice, the notion of consulting engineering being a practice. There were very few companies. You didn't have to tender. The public sector was very well capacitated, and they called you in your office because they knew that these various consultants have the specialist expertise and the capacity that could be of value to the public service, public entity, be it a municipality, a roads agency. Back then, there was no SANRAL. It was, you had this provincial references, Transvaal Provincial Roads and Natal Roads and so on. And they all never had the total in-house capacity or the specialist knowledge. And this is when they'd pick up the phone and in sequence, make contact with various consulting engineering companies and invite them to, provide a cost for providing your services. And the pricing was normal. It was sustainable for the industry, unlike what the modern era tendering process has done. So, yeah. So moving on, I then found myself being restless and curious. I moved on from that company to another company, which I don't know if I necessarily want to give them all the marketing mileage, but I will name them nonetheless. So I then went on to work for SRK. And SRK were based in Anderson Street in Johannesburg, right down in the mining precinct, because that was the core of most of their business. And I spent some time there. And it was then, having learned some of the things and the curiosities that played out at Arup around using technology to make your job easier. Myself and a colleague who's now really doing well at one of our member companies. We taught ourselves how to program. Firstly, having been exposed to basic programming language back then, and used then the old Hewlett Packard calculators and did some programming to do vertical alignment calculations, and even some survey reductions, and that we then also self-taught on these really antiquated HP computers that were available then, which you had to feed in the magnetic disk so that it understood what you wanted it to do. And then you typed in all of your commands, and then you put in your data. And I get to, oh yes, and by the way, that was back in about 88. And it was about that time that CAD started coming into being, and they were amber screens. Not amber was the best color you could get at the time, aside from black and white. They were not color. They were not HD either. So and they were mainframe driven too, by the way. So we, they were not the modern fast PCs that we have, or even laptops. Over at SRK, we produced designs and drawings, and the process there was, I would do the design of a long section of a road or some long drainage system, and draw that up on paper, and then hand it over to the next department, which was the tracers. There were people who did that back in the day. We did the drawing, and the tracers would then transcribe it, clear sheet of paper over, and draw it up in ink very neatly. And I looked at this situation, and lo and behold, in the corner near our CAD stations, there was a plotter, and it was an A3 plotter at best. And I looked at this, and I said to myself, but hold on, there's got to be a more efficient way of doing these things. And I started getting curious, and I started producing my designs and then getting them printed out on the A3 plotter. And then you could have, of course, just joined these sheets and made it easier for the tracers to do what they needed to do. That didn't stop there, because the company invested in an A0 plotter at one stage, and nobody knew whether this plotter was compatible with the computers that we used, and whether it could replace the A3 plotter that we then used back then. And I experimented. I didn't go and ask for permission. I was not the senior technician. My senior technician didn't even know what I was doing. But I knew that I'm not going to do damage. If what I'm doing now works, then it would save so much time and create so much more efficiency in how we are delivering and producing our drawings, without necessarily making people in the related department redundant. And it worked. I got to print out and plot a whole A0 long section on the big plotter. Didn't need to be traced or pages stuck together and so on. And so my senior technician came along, saw what I did. It was revolutionary to him. And all he said to me is, I'm not going to interfere in what you do ever again. And that was great, made me feel good. Because he also realized that he didn't have the technical curiosity that I had at the time. I made it work, and I didn't break anything. And it all worked out well. I then even at that company had the opportunity to spend time on construction sites as resident engineer. The NCP factory Kloorkop, just the other day I was at the CESA conference, and I stopped at the NCP Kloorkop stand, because these days in the water process, chlorine production and using salt and all of those minerals was part of their core business. And I related the story to one of the guys there, and he actually, paid me a compliment because a lot of what I'd reflected on that we had built back then is still standing
Wow.
and in good condition, despite the aggressive environment. Because you can imagine these bunkers being exposed, concrete bunkers being exposed to aggressive material such as salt and various other chemicals. I also spent time on construction supervision on a stormwater canal project in Boksburg, which was to relieve the flooding problem that they would have, and rather create a large canal that would channel stormwater from the rainfall events all the way, and safely so, towards the lake. That worked out well.
So how
My
was your
next-
experience transitioning from office to?
So
Being
it was,
outside as a resident
it was a quite a, winters weren't pleasant. The site offices were not. So the best you had was a heater and you have a warm jacket and so on. But it was when you started to teach yourself to self-manage. I had no boss standing over me. And that was great. But it was also for me a, you know, a growth in realizing, actually, I'm here to do a job. These are my outputs. These are the records I need to keep. This is the interaction I need to have with the contractor. This is the cycle that I need to walk around the site, have a look, observe, and relate any untoward observations. Yeah, you know, so it was a different learning experience, but it complemented what I had learned in the office. And the two went well because I could then make more sense out of, well, when I design stuff in the future, I also need to know what's practical on a contractor on a site, because unfortunately, you know, in many other countries, there is an aspect of engineering which is referred to as value engineering. We don't have that opportunity because what that involves is the client is meant to bring the contractor on board at the design stage already. So, you know, you've got relationships. It's not premised on a tender and, okay, who am I awarding it to? And the contractor could then give advice on, okay, so this is what you're thinking of in your design, but if you did it this way, it makes it so much more easier, more practical for me in my construction process. And lo and behold, it reduces the cost of construction because it's less complex, it's more practical, and it works.
Sure, also reduces the risks.
All of those, you start now taking out all of those risks, and that's the process of the value engineering. Because there aren't now issues that the contractor is going to pick up that cause delays. And now we start having a fight about, oh, so, you know, who's responsible for the delays and who's going to be liable for the additional claims and so on. Of course, the client never wants to be the party responsible for that, and rightfully so, unless, of course, they have been unreasonable and there are claims that they should be they should honor. My next port of call was then with a small boutique kind of consulting practice, because the previous two were quite large at the time. I mean, there must be quite a few employees, at least over 50, close to 100. So they were quite large firms. Next port of call was a company which doesn't exist anymore. But back then it was Leach, Price and Associates. Some of my colleagues who may be at MPA Mott may remember one of the mentors that had been employed by PDNA, Brian Leach. He was the head, one of the senior partners there, and they were a sum total of 4 partners, and we were about 5. So we were no more than 12 people in the office. And that, in a small company, was another learning and growth experience, because I arrived there, had lots of knowledge on roads and stormwater design, and I'd never really done much in water design and sewer design. And suddenly, I'm required to design these things. And, I had to pull a rabbit out of the hat, learn on my feet, get more information, refer back to some of my notes. And, it all sort of came together, but not without. And again, I would also hasten to add that even in my time right back at Arab, there was an elderly gentleman. I think he must be passed on because back then he was very gray already. Paul Monk. And he was one of the best mentors one could have because he would invest the time, sit down. I still have some of his notes and his drawings that he sketched on stormwater design for curb inlets and all of the above that were generally used by the city of Johannesburg back then. They had a whole engineering department. And a similar thing then happened I'd say in my Leach Price days. It was not on my own. Woodmead Shopping Centre, that whole complex, it was vacant land. We had the project, I had to design all the services. And the vexing question there on that project was, okay, the whole site slopes down eventually to one point, which borders the motorway, the M1, just before the Kloof. The existing pipe underneath the highway, which was then already quite in place, was of limited size. I do forget the exact size, but certainly not large enough to accommodate the stormwater that would come off the site all at one go. And obviously, in my technician, even right at the high diploma level, we hadn't done a lot on retention ponds and all of the above. And lo and behold, there was a specialist. He's a member, Chris Brooker. He was one of the partners there, and he helped me and showed me what needs to be done and how do you attenuate the water so that it doesn't all arrive at one point at the same time and then throttle the system that the road crossing stormwater system can't cope with. And I think, and I know that still works. If anybody can ever get to the fence line on that property all the way, by the way, that property used to belong totally to a Mia trust. And that was land bequeathed to the Mia family by the British government during colonial times. You'll see a fishing shop that's still in that complex. That was all that existed on that entire piece of land before we developed it, all the services, and it became what it is today. So that was my journey at Leach Price. And of course, things started happening in the industry, things slowed down, and I found myself sitting idle, not enough work coming from clients, and the curiosity bug got me. Lo and behold, found myself with another company, George Hutting, GM Hutting and Partners, GMH, in fact, working in Soweto, supervising the labor-based and labor-intensive road construction projects. The team of junior technicians. We had a senior engineer who did the oversight. We were based in an office in Pimville in Soweto. And we then progressed to convert what was all gravel roads, some to premix tar roads, to paved blocks and even waterbound macadam. But the process was twofold. It wasn't only intended for job creation, it was also, we had local contractors that we were developing. So it was a contractor development program, whom we were then equipping with additional skills and knowledge to, one day become successful contractors. And the one that I can best recall is a company by the name of NS Apani, Steve Apani. That company still exists as a contractor today, from that. Interesting experiences all over Soweto at the time that, I guess, if you used Dickensian expression, it was the best of times, but also the worst of times. Back then, I do recall one of my experiences then already, 1993. You must just check the clock for me, okay? So 1993, 1992, working being in Pumville, Chapavu, Naledi, and there we found ourselves in Mdeni. Now, anybody can relate to, has been any knowledge of Soweto environment, Mdeni was a total no-go area. That was where a lot of the action and criminality and all of the things took place. And we were on a one of the sites one day. And yeah, lo and behold, my colleague, old Steve, is the contractor. We had learned a long time then already not to bring our cars to the site. Because lo and behold, hijacking took place back then already. And I used to drive a little Nissan 1400, which is a company bakkie, and we had Soweto stickers on it and all of the above. If you can picture this, I even used to wear a cap, New York cap, backwards, with an overall on the site. I'd been approached by so many of the local sources to buy their goods, ill-gotten goods. And of course, yeah, I won't go into the detail on that. Certainly not behavior encouraged. But on that particular day, we just found ourselves in a really precarious situation with communities and the school kids not understanding what are we actually doing and perceived us to be intruders. So, needless to say, and I won't go into the gory detail, I then arranged with one of my colleagues we talked to the headmaster of the school and asked him if we could address the entire school at assembly so that we could demystify what we are doing and how this is for the benefit of the community and how we need the community buy-in, because it would then prevent the hijacking and the robbing and all of those things that were taking place of people and employees and even ourselves, which I did. And I had to clarify to people and young kids who'd probably seen, and this is how life was back then. Some of them hadn't seen somebody who looked like me, or different from themselves, ever. It was that kind of environment, and I had to dispel this myth that I am from this. Firstly, and the expression I learned was "Angsumlungu," and that translated means, actually, guys, I'm not the white guy that you don't like, because that was what life was back then, rightfully or wrongfully so. Hopefully we should have overgrown a lot of those, or outgrown a lot of that hangover, and discriminate between bad people and good people on a very different basis. We were never again bothered by the criminals in that environment. And for me, that was a lesson long ago on how one needs to include communities in your design work. And the lesson for many years, as engineers, we learned, and we bright and brilliant when we've learned all of these things. But if we do not find an opportunity to involve communities in our thinking, as untrained as people may be, you may come up with solutions that are not practical, that are not used by community. I think the most classical one that you will still find is footbridges crossing motorways. If you'd ever gone to talk to the people there, you might actually locate it where it's more convenient. You look for the well-trodden grass path. Don't decide that actually 10, 15 meters scientifically, this is it. People will not use it. They'll still cross where they did before. Railways, exactly the same, situation. And, you imagine, and we think we're trying to think on their behalf. let's include them in the thinking process. And if sometimes what people are proposing is you also help educate them on what's prompting your thinking, and you get to understand better. At the end of the day, your infrastructure is more usable and utilized. I mean, the weirdest thing you'll find often is if you do paving the sidewalks and you assume that people will always be obedient and walk all the way to the end and then make a right angle turn and then walk in the other direction, think again.
It's not gonna happen.
People are gonna cut. There's the township lingo, the double up. That's the shortcut. People will make their own shortcuts
I
because
think you see that every,
you always find it, and we've learned. You do see that thinking now.
Mhm.
You still always need that right angle portion because people may want to cross.
Mhm.
But if your journey is simply going to mean a kind of turn, then that's more practical. I then embarked on a journey on what was then the master's diploma in civil engineering, which became rather impractical back then because it required a thesis. And I was still working in consulting engineering. And if you ever tried to do a thesis back then on engineering in a consulting engineering company with as little exposure as possible to what goes into writing a thesis, it's so hard to get out of the blocks. I just never did. Instead, what I chose was I made inquiries at our local universities to see can I transition from my technologist studies to the BSc. And I was then informed that actually, you know what, you'd like to go back to first year, which wasn't so tenable. But I also in parallel had applied for a scholarship to go and study at the university in the US. It was then through United States Agency for International Development. They had a program through what was known as Institute of International Education. And I then was awarded a scholarship to go and study in the US. The premise there was, well, you're going to have to go to first year. And I said to myself, well, if I'm going to have to go back to first year at the age of 29, 30, I might as well do it in style in a totally different environment and maybe broaden my horizons completely. And by the way, if anybody wants to know what determination you need to have, I've been married for a few years, and that was by then we had our second child. So it was a case of almost hitting a reset button. Here we are. I'd bought a house, lived in the south of Joburg in Annandale. And what people may all imagine is, so you've got all these trappings of what appeared to be a comfortable life, but it wasn't enough. And luckily I had a very supportive wife, pursued further studies. We hit the reset button for real, went to the US. I fortunately, having done well in my studies right from the get-go. For example, after my first semester doing land surveying with the professor there, he took me on as his teaching assistant, something, the privilege that's afforded mostly to only master's level students. I hadn't even graduated. And there I was, but he recognized I had lots of prior experience and knowledge, which I had through my previous phase in my life of my career. And yeah, I'm going to go a bit faster now. And I also built up sufficient rapport for the other faculty to recognize that there's enough prior learning that they evaluated my courses that I had done. I finished my 4-year degree in 2 years. I went on to start on my master's in civil engineering. And as life would have it, politics can work against you because we hit 1994, New South Africa. The American government became less sympathetic to us students. And then they simply said to people like myself, hey, you only came here for 1 degree, we're not gonna let you finish 2 degrees. You're gonna go home. So, but hey, I got 1 course and a thesis to do. The university was prepared to keep me to do that, but the rules, government just said, you're gone. And lo and behold, in the visa was a clause that said, you may only return after 2 years to the same country. And I didn't have a choice. I couldn't also, renege on that and be kicked out like a criminal. So back to South Africa, myself, my family started. And my first company I joined was PDNA, was PD Naidu and Associates back then. Again, consulting.
Was there a big shift in the landscape after 94 elections? Or not really?
Well, the landscape, it was a big shift because back then, the company like PD Naidu and Associates were really fledgling companies. It was still back then largely a very conservative industry premised on the historical past pre-94. And companies like PD Naidu and Dempsey, I first met Dempsey even before I went to the States, and he was trying to get a consulting business company going. And he'd been doing work in his garage at the time, so it became more formalized and more opportunities were becoming available through a roster system at Public Works. So companies were getting a foot in the door and not just getting a name on a list and never to be awarded a project. There was a healthy rollover in companies. And this is how some of those companies got to be where they got. The Gobas, PDNAs, and those were, Eliso, those were, and Yeleti, those were companies that started back then. But we got a project at PDNA on stage, and it was on railways, and we all looked at each other, and none of us had a clue what happens in a railway environment. And I happened to be the one now tasked with the civil engineering, but unfortunately, it was just the drainage. So, we got on with the project, but we didn't know enough more of that. And as fate would have it, I was then offered an opportunity to join the then Spoornet, now known as Transnet Freight Rail, in the infrastructure maintenance division. And which I did, started there as a hard engineer, techie, responsible for the geotech and environmental aspects of maintenance of, the infrastructure. And the lesson that I picked up out of that, many gained from is, if ever you are, have a vexing question around why do things happen this way? There was a situation on one of the branch lines. They had perennial flooding, and the flooding would then wash away the track and all of these stones, the ballast. And as the senior engineer, having joined that environment, I then asked the people, so this what course, which was bone dry at the time. I asked him, so what's this area called? And they said to me, it's called sterkstroom. Well, that's an Afrikaans term. Translated means a strong stream. And that for me was like a revelation, because then I said, but hold on. Then historically, people who know this area well would know that you would have flood events some of the time. And if your drainage system is inadequate, it's never going to go. Because it's not a mild stream, it's not a trickle of water.
Yeah, they've named it accordingly.
They've named it accordingly. It was bone dry for very long, and that's what you guys have forgotten. And that's what the cause of the problem was, and that laid the ground for reassessing the adequacy of the stormwater system. Because otherwise you're going to be inundated. You either then have to attenuate the flood, because normally where we put the crossing is normally where there would, in any case, be the low-lying area and water would find its path there.
I think this goes back to your earlier point of involving the community. They sometimes know better.
So there was no community to consult.
Yeah.
but it was looking at history,
Mm.
looking at simple naming places that can give you a hint as to what might be the cause. Because that's what we trained as engineers to do. We need to understand what's the root cause, then we know what problem we're solving, what to address. And I came across many of those situations. It was a great, illustrious career at Transnet Freight Rail. I must say that for what one perceived, and it demystified for me all of those students that I studied back in the days at Tech. And I learned then because there was a massive library in that institution that they could go to and spend hours in, which at best, we need to go to the Joburg Library and hope to find a technical book there that could help you. That wasn't outdated, and you wouldn't. Not like the universities. Universities were then equipped with decent libraries. The universities of technology, the old technicons didn't. So that railway environment, after so many years, I moved on from the hardcore technical, realized that I'm now, getting curious, and I ended up in materials management for infrastructure maintenance, and eventually the whole procurement of materials and contracts for the infrastructure maintenance, because not all of the work was done in-house. We had to procure some of it, and we had to commission the services of various contractors to do that work, which was now a different dimension from the
contract management,
yes,
people management.
And I realized at the time that actually, you know what? I've always done the technical stuff only. What do I know about managing people and operations and all of that? And that's when I did a management development program, not unlike what we offer here at CESA. And it gave me more tools in my toolkit on how, as a technical person, as a core, to be able to be more competent in understanding what the finances that related to my environment, the people and the relatability, and managing people, marketing, operations and efficiency, and then legal aspects, and even communication, and negotiation. So that made me better and more confident in my management environment of a technical, which I think at the moment in too many environments, when you consider that the core of a business is technical, to have a non-technical person, it's like you don't quite understand the core, and maybe that's the problem here. You've learned the lingo. You can say a few smart words, but you don't really know what you're managing, and that's why it's always important to have core, but then the rest of the toolkit. If you want to see a successful SOE, a technical SOE, and I'm going to be blunt about that. It's what made them work so well back then. And if we take lessons from other countries, in China, if you look at the mind-blowing projects that they pull off, and you look at the capability and the engineers that are employed in those ministries that advise them, maybe we should take a leaf out of how they've approached it, and we can solve all these problems and address the needs of people and our economy. So around about at that same stage, back in the late 90s, I had also started getting more involved in institutional work. Strange as it may seem, I was actually also I was the chairman of SAPTACO in 1998. Who would have known? But and I then got more involved in CESA, Institution of Civil Engineering. I was vice president at CESA for ongoing period of about 6 years, and I think it was about the same time that I was at Spurnet, just before I moved on from there, that I was then offered the opportunity I was elected to the Engineering Council as a normal council member. sat there 50 with really giants in our industry. I would actually certainly, sing their praises. The Sam Amuts, the Nazir Alis, the Dempsey Naidu, Alison Lawless. You think of all the really outstanding, Truman Goba, all the outstanding people that you see that are now heading into retirement. Those were, the people that I'd had the privilege of serving on the engineering council. And I then also went on to merit being elected to serve as the president of the engineering council. And there's so many other stories I could relate about that, but we will run out of time, which we are rapidly. And I think, at that time too, I had the realization that as South African engineers, and I was still with Transnet at the time, as South African engineers, and by the way, I had just left Transnet and rejoined PDNA.
Okay.
Lo and behold, full circle, back to PDNA. I ventured back into consulting engineering. And I realized that as South African engineers, we are so highly revered that it was a tragedy that Engineering Council was not more present and more visible in the international space in the form of an organization known as the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, headquartered in Paris. And we started getting more involved there. I then headed what was a capacity building committee as a deputy president of the World Federation. Great experience, great exposure, interacting with people at UNESCO who fund these programs and engineering and development of engineering worldwide. I got books here on my shelves here on renewable energy that I'd gotten at Warfield conferences back in the early 2000s, long before we started looking at solar PV and wind and all of the above. So, we started also getting on top of those technologies in South Africa. I think at some stage, having left Transnet back in PDNA, and this is where your journey should lead you. I was not looking for a job. Were things working out perfectly? Then yes, I was a director there. I was the COO of one of the other businesses in the group. A very interesting angle on engineering and entrepreneurship, which I enjoyed as well. Which unfortunately, in the interest of time, I won't go into the detail of. But essentially, we were looking at economic development around engineering and how could we encourage and through service to client, Mpumalanga Provincial Government Economic Development Department, how could we maximize existing infrastructure and build on it with more infrastructure that would stimulate economic growth. These days, you'll see on the N3 TC, N3, is it N3? I forget which one. It's the Maputo Corridor, is what it was known then. Still known as. It's the road to Nelspruit to Mozambique. You'll see truck stops there. There were no truck stops then. So those were all the thoughts of how could you catalyze and build off current infrastructure. There were other projects which of course didn't materialize. But lo and behold, an old colleague of mine from a manufacturing company known as Average Infraset comes along and he says to me, hey, would you be bold enough to come and join us in our environment? Because I'm looking for somebody who knows more about railways and so on, to build and grow that part of the business now. Had I been in manufacturing before? No. Am I a bold engineer who's learned about problem solving and then quickly fitting in and finding out? Yes. And I went along and, I think it was a great experience, learning more from the old days, what goes into concrete technology, and then applying operations management, making production processes more efficient, being more, aware of the people in the environment, the work that they're doing. How can you make it safer? How can you get more efficiencies in it? And of course, you had a factory manager who was responsible for the plant itself. And the one of my plants of quite a few was in Brakpan, great old Brakpan, down there in on the eastern side of Johannesburg, one of its largest production facilities. But I also then was responsible for the factory in the R. Now, the R is like going to another country. Literally, because you'd have to go from Joburg, fly to Kimberley or to Bloem, and take a 4-hour drive from there before you got to. So, but again, all of the things that I'd learned before and the appetite to learn more from people, what makes people tick over here. The factory manager, what are the gaps in your training that I can help you with so that you can grow? Because then you're going to be better at what you're doing. It takes a lot more of me because we have to be part of the same team, and so on. And even as far afield as Kafui in Zambia, there's another one of the plants. And yeah, so that was Avalanche, Infraset, precast concrete, railway sleepers, concrete poles that you see for lighting, masks for railway overhead traction equipment. And of course, my parallel career in institutional work, as I said, I was in CESA, CESA, Burfield. The opportunity came to, would you want to venture into managing an entity like CESA, Consulting Engineers South Africa? And I said to myself, oh, you know what? That would be interesting because it would give me an opportunity to then look at how, as an engineer, do I solve problems of a different kind? I've done the consulting environment stuff, the manufacturing, the client, the rail maintenance, and all of those sort of must be a journey. And again, I think maybe what I would like to leave you with is you would end up all of the time in your journey with crossroads or forks in your path. You choose one and you make the best of it, make it work. There's no going back once you've chosen a certain path, because sometimes time would have moved on. You would have also gotten older and you can't exactly go all the way to the beginning all of the time. I made that decision once. It wasn't quite the beginning. It was almost, and I'll tell you, it was the sage advice of an engineer that I worked with at SRK. He said to me, I won't use the really vulgar term he used, I'll put it in a different language. He said to me that sometimes it helps to take a few steps backward so that you can make a giant leap forward. And that actually is what happened to my career, because I did realize then that, and I am not denigrating any, I think that was my journey, but what we learn in our University of Technology days compared to what we learn at an academic university, there's a difference. And that for me was not about inferior or superior, it's different. Because there's so much more time spent on one element, whereas in the University of Technology, we were taught very quickly how to do, what are the handbooks, how do you apply it quickly. Very little of that came through the academic institution. And a lot more theory, a lot more depth into the materials, the strength of materials, and a better understanding. In fact, I think I must be one of the few civil engineers who did a course in electrical engineering. I did a course in thermodynamics. And lo and behold, I even did a course in psychology, which I think was great about the US university system. And I wish you can do it as an elective, yeah, I guess, but it's like an extra which you don't get.
I think it's so important to understand the mind of.
I did that and I did humanities. So I could understand a little bit more about people, history, processes, and even then, I think that's where my multidisciplinary curiosity came. I was hopeless in the electrical engineering labs. So even in the course, I just got through it. Thermodynamics was fun. I found it challenging, really stimulated me as a civil engineer. We don't cover those things in the civil engineering curriculum. The whole pressure, volume, temperature relationship and how they interrelate with each other. And so, that sort of is eventually when I found myself now, having gone through all the very technical stuff, and I try to stay on top of all this. I read quite a lot. I'm curious about many things. I don't limit. And at the moment, I'm rereading a book that I read 20 years ago on the history of economics. And it's a very interesting read because you can then understand better how it is that China took so long to get to where they are now and why they are doing what they're doing now. And it gives you just a very different picture. But then there's the technical aspects, and I read a lot about water and people and do a lot of, I guess, almost all of the movie channels, if I can, if I find the time, Netflix series, and I'm very open-minded. So I not only in action movies or science or technical things and so on. As a male, I'm pretty much in touch with my sexuality. I watch Bridgertons, and so I find it very interesting because it reminds me of the movies back in the day where you'd have these kingdoms and kings, except that series turns it on its head because people never look like that and people never held those positions in those times, so it's really a nice flip on the head, but fun thing to watch, along with other really action narco series and all of the above.
One of my questions was going to be, how do you manage work-life balance? And I think.
So let me just say this, something I learned a long time ago as well, is your whole life premised on, I think, with the risk of oversimplifying, it's a triangle. There's your work, there's your life, and there's your family.
Work, life, family. Work is on top? No,
you've done the triangle anyway, so don't see the triangle as standing up there. Look at it as you're looking at it flat on a sheet of paper, and you've got to navigate between those three and try and keep the best balance possible. You'll never be perfect. I mean, sometimes you've got to make trade-offs. In my Transnet career, I spent a lot of time in the infrastructure maintenance space. I was responsible for, as the senior manager, for the iron ore export line. So I would have to go from Sishen or Saldanha, somewhere else between the two, or the coal export line between Ogies and Richards Bay. So on any one week, I might be on that side of the country, and I had 2 daughters whom I put a lot of energy into empowering to make sure that they are going to be self-sufficient. You're going to do things for yourself, not how people were conditioned back in the day. Learn how to drive, all of the above. But of course, the compromise was I wasn't there every day during the week. But those are trade-offs one would have to make, because it was what was required of me in that work environment, so that I could then provide for my family and give them and afford to pay for the school fees that I wanted them to go to, and not settle for, so there were trade-offs in everything in life. So the work-life balance entailed then not too much emphasis on the work, although there was just never enough hours in the day, so you invariably come home from work and the office, have dinner, interact with the family, and then boom, you're back onto your computer and trying to do some stuff so just so you could stay. And otherwise you drown. but not to overdo it, not a midnight person. I was never the kind of person who could wake up at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning to study.
Okay.
I'd study at night. And I'd study till 11, 12 o'clock, go to bed and wake up normal time, have good night's sleep and so on. And my work patterns were the same, except in the railway environment, because of the infrastructure maintenance, when there were catastrophic incidents like derailments or collisions and all of that, and they were on my areas of responsibility because I had other colleagues who looked after the Natal Durban main line, the Kurspoort to Maputo main line. If there was a derailment, our people closer to the action, the depot managers, my depot manager in Ermelo or Freya would call me at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning to tell me, hey, bad news, this is incident that's happened, this is what we're doing, etc., etc. I then had the responsibility of reporting then further into my seniors as to what is the issue, what are we doing, how soon would we be able to get the service restored. So, yeah, you know,
emergency.
it was emergency. It was not every day, at least, but it happened occasionally. My life and work in a CESA environment, and again, sorry, I didn't finish the work-life balance thing. So I spoke about the work, then your life, your family, but your life is yourself.
I was going to ask, does family not fit into?
No, so you've got to sometimes make time for yourself. It's called me time.
Me time.
Me time.
Regular time.
It's my wife and I, we've got this understanding, for instance. She would prefer to go nowhere, not go and visit our daughters, and I'm doing something else. She's quite happy to be at home solo alone because she's having wonderful me time, and I would do that from time to time myself as well.
Okay.
And so you've got to, because you need that to recharge yourself. It's almost like you need to see yourself as a device, mobile device that from time to time you need to just put on charge and let it just relax and lie there. I realized that about myself, you know, through my journey, but also then realized that as an introvert, many people wouldn't realize, wouldn't know that. As an introvert, I did all of those tests. My Myers-Briggs was INTJ. I being introverted. And I realized, for example, when I did my executive development program at UCT, at the School of Business, we'd have this highly interactive session, and it was with senior people. We're all senior managers. People who had an MBA were coming for a refresher and all of that. It was very intense. And we'd spend some time engaging right to the end of the day. And you find yourself at the end of the day, actually, you know what? I just want to escape. And I was in a wonderful environment. Cape Town had places like Lion's Head and so on. And I'd take a drive up, just go and sit, relax quietly there, Lion's Head on my own, and just recharge.
Okay.
You need that from time to time. It's not being selfish. You need it so that you can become constantly more functional and be able to fulfill your role in work and with your family. And your family may be immediate, like you might be married, you may have a significant other, you may have kids, or you could be just your siblings and your parents. It just depends on the choices you've made in your life. You know, so you need that to be able to keep that balance. So in the CESA environment, having now had a parallel institutional career here, as CESA presented itself with some other interesting challenges, a whole lot. And I quite enjoy not only the technical advisory work that we do. A lot of companies, you know, have vexing questions on what would be the correct process for a fee. Am I being treated fairly? By the way, I'm unhappy with these bid conditions. And of course, companies, and because we're dealing with a bidding environment, sometimes immature clients don't like you to tell them. Like the old fairy tale about the emperor not having new clothes on. And they take affront, which is really unfortunate. Because for the most part, all you're trying to do as a company is to clear and get more clarity on what is it that you want and how am I meant to respond to that. And invariably, you'll find that if you were to do that as a client and as the service provider, as the consulting engineer, a immature client takes affront and they don't quite like you because they have to come across as though they know more than you. Having, being in the role of CESA, I do that actively as part of myself with my team. And for me, I always see the team is not about the individual. There is nothing that can function on their own. You can never fly solo. Some of the time you can as an engineer. I think it's the hardest thing for engineers is to make peace with the fact that I need to trust the competencies and the abilities of other people that are part of my team. I can't do it all on my own. There's just not enough hours in the day. So you need to make peace with how do you manage, even like in a project, it's multi-parties and people get held accountable and we reward them. You don't spend time disempowering them because when you disempower people, you can't hold them accountable because you actually pull the rug out from under them. Whereas they might have had a different way of solving and going, about doing and delivering what needs to be delivered. So CESA environment, I see it as a team all of the time. It's not only our internal team, it's all our committees, all our volunteers. It's an ecosystem that all of these parts need each other. And it's a real privilege to be, seen as the CEO. And these are grandiose titles, by the way. People have to be careful that it does not make you walk on water. It does not make you some superior being or anything. I think that we unfortunately in South Africa, we take putting people on a pedestal strongly. And I wish we could get back to people keep their feet on the ground. You go to a session and the minister walks in and the minister's comfortable that you don't have to stand up because you shouldn't need to. That individual is a servant to you as the public. We are not the subjects. We don't live in a monarchy. And it's just normality. Might you, out of respect, do it from time to time? Yes, but it shouldn't be an expectation, because then it gets blown out of proportion. And the other lesson in life that I then learned, what I can leave with you is, and I've interacted with, I think I've had the unfortunate privilege of being turned away from facilities and bathrooms by probably 3 presidents. Very weird as it may be. One was, I think it was the Thabo Mbeki era. At some public event or whatever it is, the presidents go to the toilet and bodyguards there. Doesn't matter how pressed you are, you will not be let into that restroom. And I had to wait my turn until the president, on his own, the entire facility, then vacated them. And a few years at the some memorial for the late Ahmed Kathrada, very similar thing. President then, Jacob Zuma, at the community center in Lenasia in South Johannesburg, a new large community center. Very same thing happened. I didn't know. Here I was just one of the guests from a company, and we've taken a table, and off I go. Of course, I was also there in capacity as the president of the engineering council, and lo and behold, I get turned away from the facilities in the restroom again, because there's a president in there. And during the World Cup, the Zambian president, off I go to the gents, the Zambian president is in the gents, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'll tell you one real great honor that I still find myself privileged to do. In my exposure with CESA, we were invited to the Zambia Association of Consulting Engineers anniversary. I think it was their 50th. And the day after the proceedings, I had the honor, along with others, I think our president then was Lynn Pretorius, and we get invited to Kenneth Kaunda's house. And that was a wow. But it was unscripted, unplanned, all of the above. It was very hot in Zambia. I had sandals on. And off we go. Didn't have time to go and change. So off we go. You know, he shepherded to his house and wait for him, and he arrives and he greets everybody and we have a few words, and then we start doing photos in the garden. There I am, old Chris Campbell, sitting next to Kenneth Kaunda with my sandals on. And there was a photograph taken. I come back to CESA offices, and the Bonolo and team, they looked at that and they were horrified. They photoshopped his shoes onto my feet for that picture. And it was such a humbling experience, because when I think of it philosophically, those were far bigger shoes than I could ever have dreamt to fill. You know, in the good times and in the role that he played in Zambia and in its history. Because, you know, we do tend to have the issue with presidents in many countries starting off well and then staying for too long, but for the good part of it. So my CESA journey has exposed me to FIDIC Africa, you know, just showcasing our South African engineering abilities in not only our technical side of things, but our institutional capability. Where, as an organization, CESA, I think we, out of the 100 members of FIDIC, we probably are in the top 10. Not probably, we are. Not only because we have so many consulting engineering companies as members, but also the value we bring and the things we do. Some of the things that we do globally, there are associations don't even, you know, they don't even do what we do. Our BCE, I think the CEO of FIDIC then, at our conference in March this year, actually made a specific point around that CESA is one of the only member associations globally that has a deliberate program for fast tracking the development of our engineers into managing consulting engineering businesses and practices, if you still want to use that technology. Because unless you have that business savvy, it's a rather hard slog, because you are managing so many moving parts. I think many of us, and you'll see it a lot with senior practitioners, they grow in their career, they become managers, and they're no more doing the design, you're doing the design, and that's the nice stuff. They're managing the finances and the people and the client interactions and all of those things. And so they get to the top end of their career, and they may retire. Guess what they want to do most?
Teach.
Come back and come and teach and do the technical things again. Because those are the things that they've enjoyed. But I call it the circle of life, if you want to call it, if you want to use a Lion King analogy. You know, things are circular. But what's important is that we have those senior people, when they reach that stage in their careers, that they happily able to share that knowledge with the next generation of engineering practitioners. I've had the privilege of that with many people, and you know, they live on through me. And you know, if you want to explore the other philosophical side of Chris, I believe also in that being how you get to live forever through other people. You might have been long gone, but
you leave a legacy.
What those legacies are in others, in whose lives you might have made a difference. And it's not like you sat them down and said, right now I'm going to take a syringe and I'm going to inject all of
Yeah.
the knowledge and all of these things. It's a relationship and it's an assimilation and a
Yeah.
parting of a knowledge. And you know, that mutual relationship is what makes for successful mentoring and the legacy. And I think all of us as senior practitioners should be embarking on free of charge. You know, and I guess my 45 minutes must be up by now, if I've not exhausted it already. But
I think we have exhausted, but there is a question.
I think I'm
in the
gonna
chat.
stop there and maybe, you know,
Yeah.
leave it open to a Q&A.
There's a question on the chat which
Yes.
ties back to what you were just speaking about. It's from Bussy Seasware, and she says, have you had mentors along the way, and how would you advise one goes about finding one? I think I've also seen this in industry. A lot
Yes.
of young engineers are maybe afraid or not sure how to approach a mentor, you know, to get those conversations going. It's unlikely that a mentor will approach you. You have to kind of make that first step.
Mm.
So what's your advice, and how have you approached the issue of mentorship in your career?
So first prize would have been in your working environment.
Mhm.
The person who's more senior to you should almost immediately, because it makes so much, it's so logical. If I am the senior person, but I need you to do some of the work because there are only so many hours in the day, then how best do we get through all of this? And we look at what is the deliverable. We employed that company to deliver something. We've got to do it as a team. You don't know enough. I know, but I've also got some time. I'm going to make time. There's always time. I'm going to make time, and I'm going to spend that time mentoring you, not broadly, but specifically. So I need you to do, and I can reflect on my stormwater design experience. So actual demonstration. Yes, the nomographs. This is the charts. This is that. This is how these things fit with each other, and so on. This is how you go about designing, positioning, and sizing of curb inlets on a road. Once you've assessed, and you break it up into pieces, but a demonstration by that senior experienced person, where that person can then extract himself from the process. You get on with it. You get stuck from time to time. That person is mature enough for you to understand that this is not like a light switch. There's a process. You got to do it a few more times. You develop that. Eventually, you become more comfortable. You just get on with it on your own. And so that's first prize if you had it. You know, in a working environment as and in any working environment, and this is how the exposures may be different. We didn't have a specific line manager back then. You did some work for that engineer, you did some work for that one, you did some work. They, between themselves, managed the time and the capacity and didn't swamp you with all of it all at once. They had arranged and, okay, I need so much this, I need this, and so on. So it takes a mature working environment as well as managers, not a management by over control. Say you work for me, and you know, and because sometimes the relationship to may not be as good. That person may not be a people's person, and sometimes not through a fault of their own. People's personalities differ, and you may just find some people are just not really good at, you know, relating. Put them in front of calculations and computers and all that, they will fly.
Yeah.
And it's an unfortunate reality in our environment that it has always been difficult for people to look at how can we make sure that there's a adequate and similar remuneration for people who are technical specialists versus those who play a management role. The one's not inferior or superior to each other, but unfortunately, the way society has it and so on,
Yeah.
you now have to become the manager.
And I think it's also the way companies are structured. If you want to climb the ranks, you have to transition from technical to management.
But it's not, it shouldn't be, but it's very difficult for people to make peace with that. there are models of remuneration that we've toyed with, even in my railway days, of how do you make equivalence so that you don't lose the technical speciality and abilities of people, because you're now putting them in an environment and in a role that they're actually not comfortable with. But maybe let's get back to the mentoring bit. So if you didn't have somebody in-house, then I would then advocate for, if you were to have the privilege of and make the time to get involved in institutional work, our CESA, young professionals, you would invariably will meet and come across other practitioners in other companies that you have just a cordial conversation with them and you get along. And you may find they quite open to being a sounding board to you, and everybody's busy. But there's always time, and these things can happen. It's just a case of managing the expectations of each and being more understanding. But if your personalities gel and you can relate to each other, it would be possible. And in any professional environment, if somebody were to want me to assist them with something right now, if I'm too busy, then it would simply be a case of saying, you know what, can I get back to you on that? I'm a little bit hectic right now. Give me a bit of time, a few days, whatever it is, and I'll get back to you. And the person doesn't feel like they've been let down or they've been it's dismissed, or that person has been dismissed. There's a need for that understanding that things don't necessarily happen instantaneously. If that person had the time immediately and they were available, then there's no better time than that time. That's the other thing I believe in. Procrastination is not a very healthy thing, because as you put things off, so many other things come up that it becomes even more difficult to fulfill that obligation. So if you have the opportunity to do it, do it then. So that's the other model. It's very difficult, I would say, to approach a total stranger, because but that's some things you may need to explore in your exposures that you may have, be it in a project environment, be it in a conference environment. Be bold. Go up to somebody. If their title is CEO, don't be scared to go up to them. And maybe this is one of the pearls that I wanted to leave with you with my president's story was, we all bleed, we all human.
True.
And the one other lesson in life is there is no such a thing as a stupid question. The problem with holding back because you feel like you're going to be stupid, and this is South African context. We were not taught at school to be bold enough, put your hand up and ask the question because you're curious. We generally say to ourselves, you know what, maybe I'm the dumb one, so maybe I should just keep quiet because clearly no one else is asking the question, so maybe they know. And the adage out of that you want to take is, I would rather feel stupid for that last few minutes than to remain uninformed for the rest of my life because I didn't ask the question.
100%, yeah.
And you know what happens most of the time? I ask the question and so many other people benefit from it.
Hopefully that's going to encourage our young professionals to put more questions on the chat right now.
I think that's part of the course. It's also the thing we've learned here with webinars and all of the above is it's so difficult on a public platform to be churning out questions and so on. You may, and so also the nature of, I guess, these non-in-person events is people may also find themselves distracted. Maybe the other thing is that we need to take from this is try to do one thing at a time and do it well.
Be present in the moment.
And be present, be engaged. You may be under pressure, you've got a deadline, you also wanted to join this webinar. Make the time later on to do that catch up, because there may be things that you could have gleaned from concentrating in this session that would actually help you in exactly what you're doing when you are working later on, or later on in your career. So I'm getting very close to the thinking that we've always thought that we can all multitask. I'm not sure your brain is wired exactly for you to be doing all of that as effectively and as efficiently as possible, all at the same time. Yes, you may be able to do them, but you are making a compromise consciously almost. And maybe just let one thing go for a little bit. Again, I also have to chalk it down to some of our psychological consciousness is many of us probably do have undiagnosed ADD. So I want to do this and I want to do that and I do that as well because try to manage that yourself. If you can, and do one thing, get it done or take it to a point, stop, do something else, take it to another point, stop, and you've got all of these things. So I manage your time. Another very important lesson which people are not conscious of. Life is stressful. Do you know why life is so stressful? It's because we don't manage our time adequately. You need to identify things that are time wasters. You also need to be more conscious of the things that are outside of your control.
100%. I've read recently that the human mind doesn't stress about the things that we don't have control on. We stress about the things that we know we could and should be doing.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just got to time block and get some tasks going.
And do those things that are within your control and get them done. We may find ourselves worrying so much about what might be or could be or all of those. And that's normal, for you to have those.
We have a question from Yunaran. It says, afternoon, sir. Do you have any advice on how to navigate interactions with a contractor as a young consultant trying to gain experience on site? I think that is, an issue when you're young and you're on site and the contractor is expected to take instruction from you. So what would your advice be?
Guess what? I was in my mid-20s. I wasn't even 30. So I was a young person on a site with an older contractor. And I guess you need to find a way of developing a relationship. Was myself and the contractor, were they relatable? Not necessarily. Completely different backgrounds. He was a contractor, and contractors are generally, I don't want to say unrefined, but he used much harsher language than I would, which is the nature of contractors. They speak, and they speak their minds, but they do it. So find a way of developing a relationship on the site. A not so personal, but at least have a chat, not work related. It helps break down the barriers so that eventually, and that person also understands that you've got a role to play. And you mustn't assume the role of, I think the best analogy is what kids would say, you're not the boss of me. Don't assume the role of, I am your boss. I'm not. I'm here to perform a different role from you. My role is to provide the oversight on behalf of my company for the client. Your role is to do the work, follow it, and if there are complexities or issues and so on, we must talk about it. If it's going to lead to a claim or a delay or whatever it is, we must talk about it. So that I have a better understanding, and myself, being inexperienced, I refer to my seniors for better advice. You never expected as a young person to know everything. You're also not there to make snap decisions. You don't have the experience to do that. So you refer to your seniors, you then come back. Your role as a young person there is be the eyes and ears of the senior person. They take the advice but build a relationship. And what was great at the time, and maybe sites work differently. On the Fridays, they'd have a braai on the site. And we'd enjoy a piece of meat together and have a chat and so on. And it distresses. So they, I know it's not encouraged anymore, but then nobody's working on the site. They stopped working for the day, and in some environments, it may be a soft drink, it may be a beer, whatever it is. Not too many if you still have to drive, or hardly any if you still have to drive. But certainly, you get to relate to each other more on a personal level and not clinically, only around what your roles are. That helps break down the barriers, the perceptions that you may have of each other.
Okay.
That create that.
So I think just to summarize, it's about creating communication channels.
Yeah.
And breaking down that barrier.
And the trust, you
Yeah.
create a mutual trust, and I'm not here to rat on you.
Yeah.
But certainly, if we've had that conversation and here's the information, and the information is saying it should be like, one of the key things that you can't look away from, that you have to bring up with the contractor and refer to your seniors is, if you're on a site where there is reinforced concrete, every bar of reinforcing that is in the drawings has to be there and in place, with the correct cover and all of the above. You've got to check that.
Okay.
It's not a case of them assuming you don't trust them. You must check it
For doing your job.
because you're doing it's part of your job. You've got to check, because once you've poured the concrete, it's too late. It's very difficult, and it becomes very expensive, and it will cause a delay to remedy the problem if certain rebar of the reinforcing have been left out, or there is sufficient cover. Your concrete will not perform the role that it's meant to if you don't. For instance, on the bottom, you have those cover block supports that keep it off, so that you do get at least a 50 millimeter cover or so on a floor slab. Even if it's mesh, your mesh can't lay flat on the ground. Even if somebody assumes it's buried, it should be embedded in the concrete, at least to the depth of the design. And that's your role to make sure of.
Okay.
And then you mustn't be afraid to be the boss, because you're doing your job. And that's where the professional relationship then has to kick in, because there are consequences to you and your company, and that's your role then. And if this other person doesn't realize there are consequences to themselves and their company by taking shortcuts and not listening to what you've observed, then, and you have the authority, then you stop. If that rebar is not right and the cover is not the way it is designed, doesn't matter if the concrete mixer trucks are on site already and they're there to pour. It must stop.
So I think communication with the contractor then is important, but you also need to communicate with your seniors to find out
All of the
from
time.
your experience, when this is happening on site, what should I, as the young resident engineer, be looking out for?
It's part of
Because you
being
won't
mentored.
know what,
It's part of being mentored.
100%.
You don't wake up one day and suddenly you know everything.
Exactly.
So, in that kind of environment, I've actually had those kinds of experiences. And unfortunately, you may slip up, or fortunately they're not catastrophic. What you want to do is avoid situations becoming too catastrophic, and you're not expected to know everything. So pick up the mobile phone. Back then, we never had mobile phones.
Pick up the landline.
Using the landline. Call the senior engineer or the design engineer in the office and say, hey, this is the situation. What do I do?
Okay, I think that answers the question really well.
Yes.
I just want to quickly refer to some of the papers and articles. You've always been an advocate for engineers in South Africa and a thought leader on many aspects. So with reference to one paper, I didn't include the link. It's the paper that you wrote on the unintended consequences of tendering for consulting engineers, where you spoke of now the shift towards focusing solely or mostly on the cost effectiveness of tenders. We know that when we tender, there's gateways that we pass, in terms of functional and
Yes.
quality criteria, but after you pass that gateways, it's, your price versus the next person's
Yes.
price. So, as an engineer or for young engineers, how do you think we can work towards changing that competitiveness, in the bidding process? Because it does affect us. It affects,
Sure.
it affects our salaries, it affects the value of engineering services that are provided to the industry. So as a young professional, we need to be keeping these things in mind so that
Yeah.
we can in future try and change and shape the landscape differently. So what would your advice be in terms of that, in terms of cost competitiveness not being the only answer for tendering?
I think, what's important is, and unfortunately, in many other environments globally, you may find that even if you have competitive bidding, the order of magnitude of the bids are quite relative, not like the people collude, but they're mature. People know what it's really costing them.
Mhm.
And there are lower thresholds below which they know I can't afford to sustain my business. And in our South African market, okay, and by the way, also, you also have a client on the other end who knows what things should cost.
Exactly.
If I, as a client, expect a certain level of quality in the professional services, I must be prepared to pay what is the reasonable amount for the value that I'm getting. The area of tendering, it unfortunately created the notion that you are buying a professional services like a commodity. And that is so counterproductive, counterintuitive, because it's actually not the commodity. Buying a professional service, which can differ. I can price low and, hey, I'm going to make my less competent resources available. I manage the risk totally. And did you get the best solution and the best value for money? No.
No. And it doesn't take into account
And-
operations.
And the unfortunate, and this is what you as young professionals should be advocating against. One of the unintended consequences around that bidding and underbidding and underpricing. Now,
Discounting.
from a business perspective, there's always this notion that we need to stimulate cash flow in the company, so we'll bid as low as possible, so just so we can get the project. It's a false economy.
Mhm.
Because even if you're getting cash in and so on, it's so short-lived.
Mhm.
It's not going to sustain you for long. If you continue underpricing, you're eventually going to run aground. And guess what? You immediately, in doing that, it's not possible to be able to even invest in training and mentoring a younger generation engineers, because a younger practitioner who's now just joined you as a company, I can't necessarily charge your man hours up to the client, because you're still developing, you're growing and so on. So it's an investment the company is making. It explains why it has constrained mentoring so much. Because if your pricing through that bidding has gotten to that really low level, there's no margin in that to invest in mentoring and training next generation of practitioners. So, we've tried to raise that to the front because we need to be future thinking. It doesn't help for us, for example, to be looking at, we say build resilient infrastructure and we do all of this, but we're not looking at future thinking in our next generation of engineering practitioners who need to be available to take care of all of these new, technologies and new designs and design solutions. So it takes a mature client. It also will take an industry that's a bit more mature and it's an impossible thing. I've said it on many occasions, and If anybody wants to know what the Pandora's box is discounting your fees.
100%.
And when companies first made the decision to start that, it's actually a race to the bottom because of the longer term consequences. That's why even I think many companies' models are such that your senior practitioners who have specialist knowledge are no longer full-time employed. They are on a retainer. When I get the project, it never used to be like that because there used to be enough in the fee basis to make sure that I can have that person available to even mentor when there isn't the specific specialist expertise work that they're involved in. So there's a lot of these unintended consequences. But we need to, and I've, one could hope, but it will never happen. There are companies who have dug their heels in around what they know is the lowest that they'd ever go and never go below that, actually turn down a project opportunity. Sounds crazy, but there are companies that will do that. And if we had, if only we were united group of professionals and consultants, we could help self-correct, but it just takes one or two to break ranks and then, thing comes apart.
Yeah, I think the saying is, if you go to a doctor for heart surgery, you're not gonna look for the cheapest. So why when we look for engineers or why when government looks for engineers, do we look for the cheapest solution? It's not necessarily the best value.
I think, there's a lot more that needs to be done to make not only public sector clients, but even private sector. The same behavior is manifesting itself. Where you now have in a private sector client as a developer or maybe where they have more engineering practitioners who understand what is the value of what I'm purchasing, I'm acquiring through the professional service. I'm not prepared to compromise on a lesser solution. I want optimal. I'm prepared to pay you. So why you can't hope to get a first-class solution at a third-class price. If there's a mismatch. And even in a commodity environment, you can't go to the market and get first-grade potatoes at third-grade price.
Yeah.
Why would we do that with professional services, which are even harder to define than just a type of potato, a vegetable? Or so, and to take the analogy that you put there is what's missed by society, and this is where we've actually tried through our animation series, try and flight those more and more on social media, share them wherever we are. In fact, I've actually shared them as far afield as Zambia and Ghana and all of them. So people understand the value and the role that engineering practitioners play in society. It's an education process, and let's not water down the value that they play by, for example, commoditizing what it should cost you. Because here's the reality. A surgeon has only one patient on the day.
Yeah.
A building or a bridge, should it collapse, generally has many more than one person whose lives are then at stake. And why would you then compromise? And on where you're seeing the need to preserve so many more lives, and that must happen on an ongoing basis. So the surgeon, after the first patient's done or done the op, you healed, discharged, and so on. Your bridge, people expect that bridge to stand up for the next 30, 40 years. Your structure, the building, exactly the same. Because if things go pear-shaped at some point in time, they will normally come back and look at, was it the design fault? And hopefully not. But what we are seeing is with a lot of our aging infrastructure is being remiss in maintenance, which unfortunately is the responsibility of the client. And that's an area of engineering we must not neglect. We must now deliberately also play in the space of not only the glamour and the sexy new projects and all of those, but in the maintenance realm. Because just as much as we need to build new things, there's a know-how and engineering savvy that needs to go into how do you maintain it. Not unlike a very expensive car that you buy, which if you never take it for a service, is eventually going to back up more frequently. Infrastructure is no different. You know, we saw that, I know we're closing now. We saw that with the city of Joburg on the M1 motorway.
And just recently the George building.
And well, you know, the George building was a construction project in process. What went wrong there, but hard to say. And again, if as young practitioners, you are getting closer and closer to being deemed the professional, the behavior of your professional is not to prejudge situations of which you have not been a part, of which you have no detail, and avoid the speculation, because, you know, leave it to the process and all shall be revealed eventually. We must avoid getting dragged into, you know, looking for who's the guilty party, who was wrong, because it could be multiple factors at play and multiple parties. And you know, so that's in a construction process. Now, if I take infrastructure and its owners, sometimes even in your engineering career, if you do observe things that look like they are standing out of place, that look dodgy, in your engineering judgment, that doesn't look very healthy. I guess it's your moral duty as an engineering practitioner to raise it with somebody, somewhere. Drop an email to the head of some department, whatever. Sandra, guess what? As a citizen, I can't drive past and see water fountains coming out of the road, and I know that that's a burst pipe. Yes, it's not outside my house, but it's water that's being wasted, and I don't know whether the other people have necessarily reported it. I report it anyway. Because, you know, I have a bit more consciousness, because the other issue, and I've just raised it the other day with somebody at Joburg Water, said to them, you know what? You in the public sector need to stop working in silos. You need to be able to work in an integrated manner, because if you leave your excavation, you fix the water pipe, but you leave the excavation open for too long, I understand you want the soil to dry out and so on, but if you leave it for too long and it gets inundated with water, invariably it's in a road or next to a road. The road is eventually going to manifest weaknesses because it's inundated in its sublayers. You may not know that as the water department. But if you and the roads department don't talk to each other and get together rather quickly to make sure you can fix the whole thing as quickly as possible, you become your own worst enemy, because you're creating a maintenance problem for yourselves. So, you know, therein lies the advice that we should be as engineering practitioners sharing with even our clients outside of the bidding process and the project process in our networks. And people, good people will listen. You use the good people to listen to you, okay?
100%.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, we're slightly over. There's a few questions on the chat that perhaps can reach out to you via email just to respond to those a few questions. There's one on from a young lady who asked what happens when a client doesn't take a female seriously on site. And as a female engineer who's on site quite often, I think the first key, if I can respond to this question, would be to not consider yourself as that female engineer on site. Don't put yourself in the box. you're an engineer on site and be the best engineer you can be. People will then look past it.
It's no different
Yeah.
to the other younger person.
Mm.
You know, we had other dynamics. We had color at play as well.
You can imagine.
And so you were a shade darker than the contractor,
Mm.
and they don't take you seriously. So you know all of these prejudices, and you need to just put your foot down on what is your role, what is your function, and you perform that. If the other party doesn't respect that, you raise it in the meetings. You talk to your seniors about it. They don't have to respect you by virtue of being a woman. No, you're there to do a job. You are there as assigned to play the role on behalf of your company, manage the risks that relate to the project on behalf of your company. And you should be no less respected than any other person on the site. So it comes exactly down to the young person and the contractor, same kind of thing. There are many other things I could share with you even. I mean, unfortunately in this profession, you're still going to find it's very patriarchal, very much not enough consciousness of accommodating behaviors or not manifesting behaviors that may not be acceptable to others. Be more conscious of those, but not everybody necessarily embraces diversity. Some people, diversity makes them uncomfortable. And unfortunately, they have multiple aspects of their lives, and very rarely might you find that your environment and that professional relationship is probably premised on how they conduct themselves in other parts of their life anyway. How are you going to possibly change that person?
Yeah.
So then you reduce the relationship to the professional. I'm here to do my job. You will respect that. If you find that offensive, then you talk to your bosses, I'll talk to my boss, and we. So let's not disrespect each other simply by virtue of me being not of the same gender as you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think with that we can conclude, Chris. Firstly, I want to thank the CESA sponsors that we shared on the screen. To young professionals that are watching, please go onto the CESA website, www.cesa.co.za, and on the Young Professionals tab, you can join the Young Professionals Forum to join more events like this. And as Chris is mentioning, you know, you can start to network and build, find a mentor if you don't have one, and start speaking to more people in industry. It's really a great platform to grow in your personal development as well. And you can also find out about other opportunities and events that the CESA YPF is hosting. Chris, I think, thank you for that invaluable, journey that you shared with us. There was lots of lessons that came through from that for myself personally, and I'm sure for the young professionals. I think, to summarize, you mentioned a lot about, seizing opportunities. When opportunities came to you, you really just seized it. You were a yes man. If it meant moving to another company, moving to another country, putting yourself in an uncomfortable position, you did it for your career growth. And also that has benefited the industry a lot. And we thank you for that. We thank you for your contribution to CESA and to the industry at large. There's lots of other lessons that you shared. I think most importantly for me, it's just your journey and, doing the right thing, being involved in the broader space or the broader landscape, not just sticking to your role. And I think your work with all of the different organizations really comes through with that. And we're looking forward to learning more about your journey. And I think I did also share some of Chris's opinion pieces, articles. You can find them on Business Live, etc. I have some links. So you can just also, as a young professional, learn more about the industry and the landscape. It's important to understand where things are and where they should be. So thank you everyone. I hope you have a great evening. And Chris, do you want to just quickly maybe just summarize with one sentence?
No, I think that thank you very much. Because it's always an honor and a privilege to be able to share with people of all ages and all walks of life. And I think in my final parting shot for you is build your own brand. Build yourself as the brand. And opportunities then come to you. So, and how you go about doing that is maintain your credibility. Protect your credibility, don't compromise, but be flexible. But not to the extent where you get involved in doing the wrong things, because those things catch up with you. So, build your brand, stay the course, and things work out. Your dreams will eventually materialize. So yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
You got it. Build your brand, build a credible brand, and you can attain whatever you desire. Thank you, young professionals. Have a nice day further.